Okay, now, yeah, you can hear me?
Yes, we do.
Good. Yeah, okay. All right. I'll begin it this way. It all started with a course I took at York. Anyway, um, third year I took a language and culture course. The assignment was a huge part of the marks. So I went down to what was then called the Indian Friendship Center, and found Anishinaabe elder who was teaching his language. Um, he taught me not only words in the language, including, we named one of our dogs that we had Weekwas because he was white with black spots, and Weekwas means birch in Anishinaabe. Now, when I saw his passion and experienced his passion for the language, and he had lost it at residential schools, but his grandmother had taught him, retaught him the language. And he went later on to help establish the language program at Trent, and is considered by many, a great teacher of the language and instigator of good programs. So it begins with that, right? All right. Now, you already know one Wendat word. You probably don't know it's Wendat word, and you probably don't know the meaning. It's Ontario. Okay. Ontario means it is a large or great lake, right? Which is a fairly easy thing to remember. Ontaire is a noun or noun root. The EO is a verb root meaning to be large or to be great. Now, sadly, until 2019, there was only one Wendat place name in Ontario. But now there are two. The second one, I've been practicing this one because it's a long one. The second one refers to a park in the northern part of Don Mills, not far from the Don River. It was called Woodsy Park, but now it's called Ehenanwahawastehene, which means where they had a beautiful life. So I love the name. I'm really glad they didn't call Dundas by that name, because nobody could ever tell somebody in a taxi where to go. Okay, so now the word Wendat, you may see in several sources that it means peninsula or island. It doesn't. We don't know what it means. We have no idea what it means. Now, the word Wyandot is a related people. They live in Michigan, Kansas, and Oklahoma. I worked for the Wyandot of Oklahoma as the tribal linguist for 5 years, which was really, really neat. Even though there was no way to teach people in Oklahoma nasal vowels because they have no exposure to French, right? So I'd say, well, it's on like in bon. And I would get this look. What do you mean? So anyway, but great people. Now, Wendat belongs to a family of languages. The family it belongs to is Iroquoian. Now, there are 11 language families or language isolates in Canada, and Iroquoian is one of those families. Wendat, therefore, is related to the language of the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora in Canada. In the US, it's also related to Cherokee, but I can't make any sense out of Cherokee. It's way too different. Now, one way you tell that languages are related is you look for what are called cognates, related terms. So for example, on the list I gave you, the word for food in the languages I mentioned is almost always the noun root is something like qua, right? So you see that, you say, these languages are related. Now, there is a related language that gave us the name of our country. Now, these people are the St. Lawrence Iroquoian. They lived obviously by the St. Lawrence. The language died probably sometime in the 17th century. the word Canada or Kanata means village or community, right? I said once when I presented a little lecture at a local um, uh, middle school, I said, I am glad that, the story goes that Cartier was pointed to a village and saying, what do you call this land? And they said, oh, it's a village, Canada, right? And I used to say, and until I gave a little lecture at the school, aren't you glad that that he wasn't pointing to dog poop? Because that would be our name, right? And after that, the students at that school called me Dr. Dog Poop, right? You live by what you say. Okay, so St. Lawrence Iroquoian was it also gave us the word Hochelaga, which refers to a beaver lodge, which is pretty much, if you approach Montreal Island by the river, it kind of looks like that if you have a good imagination, right? Now, fortunately, I was able to teach myself this language because of the Jesuits. They were brilliant linguists. We're so fortunate that they were the ones to record the language. I can say that the grammars and dictionaries of 17th century Wendat were better than any dictionaries of the English language until the 19th century with the Oxford Project, right? These are brilliant. These are my teachers. The Jesuits are my teachers of this because it's just so complete. They have the metaphors for the people. It's amazing. It's beautiful. Okay. So Wendat is a morphological language. That means that the main learning that you have to do of the language is how do you build a word, right? That's the main task. That's what you have to learn. And by the standards, it's like any indigenous language I've encountered. I worked with, obviously, Anishinaabe. I worked with Mi'kmaq. I worked with Inuktitut. I wrote this book, White Lies About the Inuit, that talked about the myth that the Inuit have 50 terms for snow. No, they don't, 6. But they build words, just like when we're talking about snow, we put little words in front of it, oh, it's snowing again, like that, right? Well, they put it into a word. They build long words. Whereas English and French are more syntactic languages. They deal more where you put the words, and they have smaller words on average. Wendat uses verbs where in English and French we use nouns. Okay. That was why for Brébeuf it was very hard to say to give the words for the trilogy, or trilogy for the why do I say it like that? Anyway, the Father and the Son. You can't say the Father and the Son because Father is a verb. You'll be learning that in the next one. All the kinship terms are verbs and they express relationship. So when you say our Father who art in heaven, that's easy to say because you say something like, you are Father to us, but there's no noun there. It's all verb. Okay, so for example, woman, there's no noun that means woman, but there's a verb that means to be a woman. Okay, so that happens a lot. And there are almost no adjectives in Wendat because verbs say it. So if you want to talk about something being large, like Ontario, large lake, you use the verb eo, to be large. If you want to say something is beautiful, it is large, it is beautiful, it is good, right? If you want to say cold, you want to say long, it's part of a verb, no adjectives. Now, these verbs can have a lot of pieces to them, a lot of parts, what are called morphemes based on the word morphology, right? They can have a lot of morphemes. It is not unusual in Wendat to have 8 parts to a verb. The long word that I badly pronounced near the beginning has 7 parts to it. That's not an especially long word in Wendat. From a Wendat perspective, that's just like you or I speaking in English and French and giving a sentence, right? Only it's one word. Okay, now, every verb must have 3 parts. That is the minimum. It must have at least 3 parts. A pronominal prefix, a verb root, and an aspect. The most complicated part of the language, I still have to check with Poitier a lot of the time. Okay, Poitier was the one who wrote the final dictionary and grammar of Wendat. That's, in the 18th century. He built on the work of people like Brebeuf and Chaumonot. Every once in a while, I say, well, what's the pronominal prefix for that? It has many complications that our languages don't have. For example, they have, in the pronominal prefixes, they have something called clusivity. So it means inclusive or exclusive of the listener. So if I say we, and I'm talking to you, I will use a different pronoun depending upon whether I'm talking about something that we share or something that we don't share. Okay, so that's one of the things it does. It also distinguishes between singular, dual, and plural, right? So it has those kind of features. Now, aspects. There are 5 different aspects. I will be talking about 2 of them today, the 2 most common ones. 5 different aspects. These are not tenses. 4 of the 5 aspects can appear in the present, in the past, and in the future. So they are not tenses. They are stative, which I'm going to talk about, habitual, which I'm going to talk about, punctual, later workshop, purposive, later workshop, imperative, right? It has to have one of those 5. All right. Now, the examples I'm going to give are examples on the sheet there. I'm going to start with 3 names, 3 men's names. I'm having a book come out hopefully before the end of the year called Names of the Wyandot. I recorded or found from different sources 600 plus names in Wyandot, and their history and their nature is so very different. The names, Anyway, so here are 3 names. Now, in each of these first 3 names, the pronominal prefix is singular, and it's called the masculine singular agent. Now, agent is very similar to patient. Agents do not appear in all verbs or nouns. They don't. But when they do, they're always the subject, always. They appear in most words, but not every word. The opposite of agent is patient, right? Is patient. Now, the patients can be subjects too when they're in the word by themselves and there's no agent hanging around. Otherwise, they're objects. When there's an agent and a patient, the agent is the subject, the patient is the object. So when I say our Father, I would say, if I'm addressing in the Lord's Prayer, I would say, you to us, our Father. Agent, you, us, patient, verb, to be father to be father to, right? There is no noun father. There's to be father to. Same thing with mother, same thing with grandparents, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so in the first one here, first one we have here, Hatayata, he is often brave, courageous, right? This is a name, right? Which is a name you'd like to have. It's a name. Now, the H typically refers to the masculine, right? When you see an H, you have some sense that there's a man. Now, this was problematic for the Jesuits because go away, cat, sorry, because being that French speakers, they had a little problem with initial H's, right? So Brebeuf's name, which was an attempt to say Jean, there is no je in Wendat, but there's she. And to make it a masculine name, they called them Héchon, right? Doesn't have a meaning, but it had a significance. It became one of the most significant names. When Brebeuf died, it was passed on, as names are, to the most likely person to deserve that name, and that was Chaumonot, because he, like Brebeuf, was an expert in the language. From there, it was passed on to Father Daniel Richer, who was also expert in the language. When I did my first session with the Wendat people, one of the Wendat called me Héchon, and that is a name I very much identify with, because like Brebeuf, Chaumonot, and Richer, I have put my life's work into the language. All right. Now, the verb root there is to be brave or to be courageous, and the aspect is the habitual, which means very often or typically, right? So you're referring to something that is repeated behavior, and so it's going to be for a lot of names. It's going to be for a lot of names. The next name, again, it's an important name, Hashaton. It means he often writes or marks, is a writer, right? It's meaning this is what he does. This is what he does. So it's a fairly easy one. Now, Heteronta he often draws or attracts, is kind of a famous name because one of the Canadian saints, martyred saints, was given that name, right? They must have had a lot of respect for him to give him that particular name. You know, it's a very important name. So, it's one of the more significant names. And again, starts with an H, you know, it's masculine. Attirant means to draw or attract. And often because you see the habitual there. Now, any questions so far? I know sometimes when you don't know something, you don't know how to ask about it.
I think that Vincent, do you have a question?
Oh, maybe could you just repeat what the suffix for habitual is? I missed it.
Okay, the suffix for habitual is you. Well, there are several. In the cases here with one, it is K sound, which it will often take following a nasal vowel, because the ON is a Jesuit way of writing on. But after T, it'll be ah. Right? So it has several forms that it takes. Okay, so it's not many. They're not many. I mean, you can tell. You see a word ending with ah like that. You know, okay, I don't know anything else about the word, but it's habitual, right? Okay. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
No other question.
All
You
right.
can also ask the question in French. We can translate if you wish.
That would be good, because although I can read French,
Yeah.
my my speaking, I have kind of like a Northern Ontario
Yeah.
Framboise, right? So
Okay. We can continue, Jan, and
Okay.
if you have questions, do not hesitate to raise your hand and John will answer. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, now nouns. Now nouns are usually incorporated into a verb. When you see or hear a noun root, it's inside a verb. It's part of a verb. It comes before the verb root. Sometimes it stands alone, but not usually. Right? So even nouns are most often part of the verb. Now they have three parts too. They have a relatively simple pronominal prefix, yea, noun root, and a noun suffix. All right, so that's fairly basic, fairly simple. Now, the nouns I've chosen here are, let's see which one's next, are four of the most common ones. You see them all the time. You hear them all the time. Now, Yarihwaha means matter, affair, news, or business. It is a very commonly recurring noun, almost always in a verb, but you see it all the time. Now, what we have here is the female, it's called the feminine zoic singular agent. It's called feminine zoic because it refers to female humans, it refers to animals, and it refers to objects. Okay, so that's why it's given that name. And why, beginning with why, is common with them, not all the time, but fairly common. So the YA here is the feminine zoic singular agent. The noun is how I've said it here. Okay. Now, the next noun is yon di yon ra'a. You may notice that when that little hook, which is a glottal stop, is written, I double the vowel. The Jesuits weren't good at recording glottal stops because they were in no language that they knew. I mean, they were brilliant linguists in many ways. They had a solid background in Greek and in Latin, which helped them when they were developing the grammar, the grammars of Wendat. But some sounds, they weren't there.
Mm-hmm.
Some sounds they could not hear, right? Because the idea was not there. You couldn't hear it because the idea of something coming at the end like that. So I write it as a repeat, as in the English which has the glottal stop in it. All right. So again, we have the feminine zoic singular agent, ya, indiora, mind or thought. Again, very, very common. If you're talking about thoughts or ideas, then this is what you use, and the noun suffix is like the others. Okay. Now, the next one, the Andawa'a, river or rapids. Now, if you're familiar with the Montreal area, you might know the Mohawk community, which is usually pronounced by my Mohawk friends as Ganawage.
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is at the rapids, at the river.
Mm-hmm.
They have G where Wendat has Ya. Right? That's one of the differences between the two languages. Actually, that's one of the differences between Wendat and pretty much all of the other Northern Iroquoian languages. So if I see ga in a word, I'm looking for ya in Wendat.
Mm-hmm.
In the dictionary, the first dictionary that I wrote, which is a big mess because I use it all the time. Ooh, nice picture. Okay. I give the cognates in the other Iroquoian languages because they are fairly closely related. You know, you can, when I see something, I can almost read Mohawk. Mohawk, I find the easiest of the other Iroquoian languages. To me, it's the easiest to understand, Mohawk and Oneida, which is very close to Mohawk. All right. Now, Wendat, word, voice, word, or promise. Right. So this is a very important word, very important noun. Again, now you've seen in the last 3 words, you get an N and then a D, N and a D, N and a D. This is a uniquely Wendat feature. The other Iroquoian languages do not have that D. That's why, like, for example, the Wendat word for village or community is Yandata, whereas, of course, in St. Lawrence Iroquoian, it is Kanata, rather. Yeah, you accent the second last syllable in these languages, almost always, right? But that's a real Wendat feature. That's one thing that makes something Wendat. When you see a nasal vowel or an N, and there's a vowel after it, the D is going to come. To use a fancy term I learned in linguistics, it's epenthetic. All right. Now, the stative aspect. This is the most commonly used aspect by far. It means being in a state of, right? Being in a state of. And again, it could be in the past. You can talk about in that long word I gave you for the park name. When I said they had a beautiful life, where they had a beautiful life, where they had a good life, that's with the state of. That's with the state of. And there it is in the past because it has na after it, which comes after the state of. All right, so, and it is the one that is, you know, it's used very much as the verb to be is used in French and in English, in that it takes an adjective and makes it a verb. Right. Okay, so Yawasti, it is good and beautiful, right? Yawasti. I think that was first page. Yeah, that's in that name about they had where they had a beautiful life, a good life. That's it, right? Otherwise, there's no word for beautiful. And I like sometimes to talk about words the language doesn't have, because that teaches you too. There's no word for ugly. No word for ugly. There are also no words for best, no words for worst. I was working on what was going to be a movie. I mean, I got a call from Hollywood. I thought, aha, I'm recognized, right? And they asked me to translate, among other things, "You are my favorite daughter." And I said, you can't say that. You can't say that in the language. You could say you're a beautiful daughter. You're many, many qualities of a daughter. But you can't say favorite. You can't say it, which is good. I like that. You also can't say perfect, which I really like, because nothing is perfect. The Italian saying, which I won't say in Italian because my Italian is horrible, even though I grew up in Toronto. Perfect is the enemy of good. If you think there's perfect, you won't improve. If you aim for perfection, you will never find it. Although I do believe there are perfect idiots out there. Most of them politicians, you know, premiers. Anyway, without mentioning any names. Hey, Doug. All right. Okay. All right. So, all right. So the next one is Yanyene. Sorry. It is a long time. So you see there in the verb is what we would express as an adjective, long, and a noun, time, right? So we've used, that tells you a little bit about how that works, right? Oh yeah, there's also no words for command or obey. Can't say it. You can put your word to someone, and you can be with someone. If you agree with someone, you're with their word. If you want somebody to follow what you have instructed, the literally translates as to put a word. Right? The word for leader means we copy him or we copy her. We imitate them, right? There's no commander or great chief or anything like that, right? It's something that, because he or she is so good, we copy that person. Okay. Then Yaranti. Yaranti. It is expressing approval. Right? So approval, there's a noun covered by it, and to express it. And again, it's a noun is part of the verb. The meaning of a noun is in there, not it doesn't have a noun in it, but it has the meaning of a noun in it. That's not confusing. It's a problem when you live with a language like this and you don't talk about it a lot. You just assume people know way too much. Okay, so no questions. Okay. Now, most words in Wendat have a noun incorporated into a verb. Most words. So most words have at least 4 parts. Okay, most words have at least 4 parts to them. And the order is consistent, right? The order is consistent. Now, these 3 words are, again, names. The first one is a female name. The other 2 are masculine names. And so the first one, Yarahatsi, she or it is called treetops or branches, right? I can't remember what clan that belongs to. Most of the, well, traditionally, they had names that belonged to clans, but they also use nicknames. They also use nicknames, right? For the various French workers that they encountered, they would give a name that relates to what the person does. He makes metal, is a blacksmith. He works with wood, obviously a carpenter, right? But people had nicknames, and they went through various names within their lives. They would not have the same name all their life. Right? And people would, particularly for the very important names, there would be, the clan matrons would be heavily involved in saying who deserves that name. Okay, that's all.
Yeah.
Hand up.
Oh, okay. So yes, is it the Wendat folks that would change names, or is it the Wendat folks that would give different names to the settlers?
Well, both cases, the Wendat and the Wendat would do both those things, right? They would do both those things. A lot of the priests were named after, they would try to at first find out what the person's name meant. For example, if your name was Pierre, you might receive the Wendat name Yaruta, which means, unsurprisingly, stone.
Mhm.
The guy who was the carpenter at Samaria among the Hurons, his last name was let's see, Couture, yeah, Guillaume Couture.
Mhm.
Now he was a carpenter,
Mm.
but his name in Wendat was Andish, he sews. Because they found out the meaning, so of course they give the meaning, which, you know, I'm sure he didn't tell his fellow carpenters that that's what his Wendat name was, because that'll be kind of embarrassing, right? You know? But yeah, so but generally you would go through names. You would be given a child's name, which could relate to instances related to your birth. Or if you were adopted into the people. There's a Wyandot name called Mud Eater, which became a very significant name among the people. From what I've seen, it first appeared to a settler boy who had escaped from Wyandots attacking the settlers and tried to hide in a river. And of course, he had his face in the mud, so they called him Mud Eater. Right? So one interesting thing, and I found this both with Wendat and Wyandot, was in the 19th century, the people were forced to have surnames.
Mm-hmm.
So what often happened was a surname would be a masculine name, because of course that meant they also, because they were traditionally matrilineal, you determine your kin, your name by your mother's side. Both the French and English said, no, you know, a name has your, you know, it's got to relate to your father, not your mother. So male names, just the single names for people, became last names, became surnames. But still they continued, both Wendat and Wyandot continued to have their names in the 19th and early 20th century. But there aren't many of them now, although for the Wendat, typically the chiefs, the grand chiefs, have a name that is Wendat too, which is good, which is important. You know, it's important that those names continue. I'm kind of a fanatic on that. Okay, so right, so this one, yeah, she is called Treetops or Branches. I don't think that's because she was tall, but you don't know. All right, now this other one, this next one, Andatayasha, means he often eats villages. This is obviously a warrior name. This is obviously a warrior name. That was a name. If you are very, you know, very powerful in war, this is a name that you could acquire. This would be a name that that would be your name. You know. I can't associate. Probably had a clan, but I cannot remember the clan because it's been a while since I've done that work. And then you just see there's he, there's Ndat village, like the Nat in Canada. There's what we call a joiner vowel, because you can't have a T followed by a Y. So it goes there. Then you have the verb to eat, and then often, right? Or frequently, or typically, or is characterized by, as I've sometimes put it. Now, the next name has a really interesting history. It is traditionally, okay, Harihuahayi, it is traditionally a Bear Clan name. And you know, you can sort of, now it was given, now the Wendat created title names for people, right? names for people who had a particular status. For example, Onontio, large mountain, was given to whoever was the governor of New France, right? And if you wanted to talk about the king of France, you would take that and say, Onontio Yahweh, which is the very big, the very significant governor, right? All right. Yeah, because that was the name they translated Montmagny's name, right? Large mountain, right? So that name was used there. This name was initially given to the Bishop Laval. So this name would, so all of the bishops during the time that were the bishops of New France or related to New France, they would be given a Bear Clan name. They would be given this Bear Clan name. That would be something that was theirs. Now, when the Pope, you would add, like with the word for governor, with the Pope, you would say, Yahweh, which means the big bishop, the large, the great bishop, right? Doing the same thing as they did. So, like I say, some of the names were the titles, just like the title Brébeuf, the head of Haitian, is passed down, right? And they would name, if someone was a missionary to another one of the Iroquoian people, the Wendat would often give them a name, and the next one who lived with those people would receive that name, right? So they use the same naming principle for the significant friend. Unfortunately, this is a flaw of the recording, and that you have men recording. We don't have any names or titles given to women, although I am absolutely certain they were given. Absolutely certain. But because it was the Jesuits recording it, it was frustrating when I was first doing the Wendat names that in the Jesuit relations, there's like 30 some female names. But Pache, when he recorded the Wyandot community in the early 18th century, included the female elders, which was great, and all the female names. I love that, because without that, I couldn't have done the Wyandot book like that, because there'd just be male names, which would be boring. And, non-inclusive. So again, like this is a name that the Bear Clan had. And different clans adopted different Jesuits. In the 19th century, you have, Pache's name. He was adopted by the Wolf Clan, and he was thought of so highly that the person that had his name before gave up the name, received another respectful name, and left it open for Pache to have, which to me shows that was significant. They called Ricardi, who was before him, that they didn't particularly like. You can kind of tell sometimes by the name they got, but they didn't. No, he was no Pache. They called him Beautiful Country because he was often talking about heaven, right? The beautiful country. And in the traditional narratives of the Wyandot, there's a story about going to the beautiful country, right? So you get that kind of thing, right? Okay, I'm just looking at, I forgot this. I'm in a later workshop, I'm going to be talking about terms for color. Now, there is no word for color. It doesn't exist, right? It's an abstract. You could say, what is it like? And then someone say, oh, it is called charcoal. That was, by the way, what they called the Jesuits. They did not call them black robes, despite what that horrible movie said. I got to review that in a major paper. I got to trash the movie. I like being able to trash movies publicly or trash anything publicly. But no, they would call, if you were a Jesuit, he is called charcoal, meaning he wears black all the time. So now I was recently asked, I get asked by the Wyandotte or Wendat, how do you say this? How do you say that? And sometimes I have to say, you can't say that. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. For example, someone asked me about 2 weeks ago, how do you say you're welcome? I had to say, you can't. I said, that's a settler thing. You might say thank you back, chow back, but why say you're welcome, right? When you assume that a good-mannered person is going to say thank you, right? I don't, but like expressions like that you would normally expect, it's not there. It's not there. Just like time, right? There's no word for time. There's no word for time. You could say, how long did it take? Also, there were terms for months, which related to major activities that happened during the month, right? Many of them after fish, because fish are pretty regular. Unlike warm or cold, fish are fairly regular when they arrive. A lot of terms related to corn, big surprise. Names of the days, that was horrible. I don't know. Yeah. And so I don't know who made them up, but the Wyandotte had these incredibly long, horrible names for days of the week. You don't need that. You don't need that. But they had them, it's like, oh, the only good one, like they were they were just horrible, but because they didn't have that, they didn't need it. There's no term for hour. Well, you can tell. Another thing we're going to do in a later workshop is how can you say what time it is, which is something, of course, they didn't have before, but they had, and they adjusted really well. They did a really good job of it. Same thing with counting, really good job with counting. And they had, because they were traders, and it was important to, one of the main games, kids game, adults game, was you would cast, say, beads, and someone would say, okay, pick up 20 beads, but you got to do it like that, right? And it would, if you picked up actually 20 beads, then you were good, right? And I'm thinking, this is pretty good if you're trading people. You can't sit in front of somebody and count what they traded you, because that means you don't trust them. But if you can just look quickly and say, that's 20, that's an important skill to have. It's an important skill to have. And as you won't be surprised by now, I hope, in counting terms, there are many counting terms. Pretty much every counting term has a verb in it, right? It has a verb in it. It always, one of the keys to Wendat or any Iroquoian language is look for the verb. Do not expect a noun. Look for the verb. Right? That's important. Animal names are verbs. The word for dog is barks often. They must have had labradoodles. We have a labradoodle who's a big noisy guy, right? And I think, they must have had labradoodles because he barks all the time, right? But so that they're like that, like most of them. Or the word for bear is, it is a bear. There's no noun for bear. It's just, it is a bear, and it follows, and so on and so on. Okay, there we have one. Yes. Yeah.
We have 10 minutes left, I must say. Do you have some question for John? Or regarding the name, John, I have a question.
Sure.
in the New France account, I noticed that they often call the governor father all the time, father or brother. They use kindship all
Yeah.
the time.
Yeah, yeah.
And but I read in some account that they use father for the French governor and brother for the English governor. Is that true? That's what I read.
Not that I know of, but then a brother, if I want to put it in traditional kinship terms, you're more closely related to a brother because your brother will belong to the same clan as you do, whereas your father belongs to another clan. So if dad's a deer and mom's a bear, you're a bear and your brother is a bear and your sister is a bear. So, yeah, and it took, yeah. Actually, what the Wendat often called, particularly in the first years, what they often called the French was nephew,
Oh, yeah.
mother's son. And they did that because they had to teach. The teaching relationship for males is mother's brother to sister's son. That's the teaching relationship. Because the Jesuits were not very good with canoes. Brebeuf said, don't even try to start paddling. They will expect you to paddle the whole way from Quebec to Saint Marie, right?
Yeah.
And, they couldn't snowshoe. They didn't know what to eat. They didn't know what was medicine, ignorant immigrants, right? So they were like nephews. You had to teach them. And you see that often in the Jesuit relations. They often refer, you see they'll call somebody a nephew. Eventually the father came out because obviously they heard for the priests, they heard people calling them fathers. So they wanted to imitate the practice and knowing it was a respect term in French.
Okay, thank you very much, John.
Okay.
We have two more questions from Fanny and Jan.
Okay. Fanny, hi.
Hi. Thanks, it's so interesting. I have a probably stupid question, but you put a lot of example with a habitual aspect that you translate as often, but it's
Often, yeah.
different. Like there's A, K.
Yeah.
Why is that so?
Because of the sound environment. You'll find that when I talk about another one too, the form taken is conditioned by sound, by the sound before it. So there may be, with each one, like the stative is often E sound, but it can be it can be on, it can be lots of different ones, but it depends on what comes before. It's sort of sound conditioned as opposed to hard and fast, right?
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay. Jan.
Hi, John. It was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm just wondering, we don't have time to talk about it probably, but you use Wyandotte and Wendat. And I wonder if you could clarify when to use which. Were they the same people or what's going on here?
Yes.
Okay, they are related people. The people who became the Wyandot became called Wyandot, which is a mispronunciation of Wendat. They lived around the Niagara Escarpment, the Blue Mountain area. The Wendat called them Taterona, which means people of the hills. Now, when they were driven out of their land, there were Wendat that joined them, but they had a separate entity, right? They were a separate entity. And the dialect that they spoke, they were called the Petun by the French because they were big time tobacco traders. They had a dialect which was similar to some of the dialects of Wendat. Wendat had about 3 or 4 dialects. One of the, 2 of them were very, very similar to Wyandot. So when the Wyandot were were driven. They went up where Lake Michigan meets Lake Ontario. Then early 17th century, Cadillac invited them down to Detroit because they were great traders and he wanted to make money. And then they became known, that mispronouncing, they became known as the Wyandot. They're still in Michigan, in the Detroit area, Wyandot. Many of the Wyandot went down to Ohio. They were the President Jackson. Anyway, President Jackson had this, okay, everybody to the west, right? The Trail of Tears, like the Trail of Tears for the Cherokee. The Wyandot had their own Trail of Tears that took them to Kansas. And there is a Wyandot community in Kansas. That was 1843. Some of them went down to Oklahoma because that was known as Indian Territory. Interestingly, one of the people that drove them out of Ontario were the Seneca. The Seneca invited them in, and their neighbors are Seneca. Which is but so the dialect is different. There's about 4 or 5 things that are different, but it just sounds like, if like when I learned I did my master's degree in Newfoundland, and I learned how to speak and understand Newfoundland English. That would be the same for the Wendat speaking Wyandot, right? And you know them, except for some of the expressions, right? But yeah, so very, very similar.
Thank you.
Okay. It is 1 o'clock right now. It went so quickly, John. It was so fascinating. It was a fascinating lecture. If we don't have other question, I'm gonna say that we are going to see you in 2 weeks. We have a lot of applaudissements. I forgot the name in English. So yeah, I thank you so much for this lesson, and hopefully everyone will be there in 2 weeks. I will be there, and thank you so much. So interesting and fascinating.
Well, it was fun for me. It was a lot of fun for me. I don't get to talk about this often enough.
Yeah, okay. Then thank you everyone. Nice to see you. Au plaisir de vous revoir dans 2 semaines. Et encore un grand merci à notre invité John Stakely pour cette leçon extraordinaire. Merci. Merci à tous. Okay.